Good morning. It is 10:24 a.m. on Sunday, June 28th, 2026. Here is your ground floor news briefing. Today's top stories are coming to you from Wired, Al Jazeera, CBS News, ESPN, Axios, Sky Sports, France 24, ABC News, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. This report is brought to you by CR Specialists, trusted roofing and storm restoration experts. After any storm, visit crspecialists.net for a free roof inspection. Ask for Keith. Story 1. 62 last-minute Prime Day weekend deals, up to 45% off, 2026. Prime Day is officially over, but many of our favorite, hand-picked deals are still available through the weekend. This story is also being covered by Bloomberg, NBC News, Wired. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 2. Stories of survivors of Venezuela's earthquakes. Rescuers in Venezuela are racing against time to find survivors after twin earthquakes left thousands missing. This story is also being covered by France 24, Fox News, Al Jazeera. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 3. This week on Sunday morning, June 28th, Jane Pauley hosts a special program celebrating our nation's semi-quincentennial, These United States, America, at 2:50. This story is also being covered by CBS News, Forbes. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 4. Argentina show they can win without Messi, but Eve. Argentina found success against Jordan without Lionel Messi, but the 38-year-old still made an impact off the bench to extend his goal record. This story is also being covered by ESPN, Sky Sports, NBC News. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 5. With Zayas out of the way, Boots Ennis looks to Jaron Boots. Ennis earned the titles, but also got the experience needed to achieve the final goal, to be undisputed and maybe fight Virgil Ortiz Jr. This story is also being covered by ESPN, Sky Sports. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 6. U.S. Iran ceasefire could go up in flames. This is more fire than cease. Over the past few days, tension between the U.S. and Iran has been escalating with another exchange of strikes on Saturday. President Trump threatened on Truth Social to resume the war and complete the job. Why it matters. The U.S. and Iran are bombing each other again, putting the tenuous ceasefire in doubt again. Between the lines, one reason for the renewed fighting. This story is also being covered by The Hill, France 24, Financial Times. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 7. England take 3 quick wickets. NZ 7 down with lead over 300 live. This story is also being covered by BBC Sport, Axios. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 8. More than 1,300 excess deaths linked to record-breaking Europe heatwave. Who says? More than 1,300 excess deaths have been recorded in connection with Europe's record-breaking heatwave since June 21st, according to the World Health Organization on Sunday. Earlier that day, health officials in France reported that there had been around 1,000 more deaths than expected in the country since Wednesday. This story is also being covered by France 24, BBC Science, Axios. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 9. No rules, no protocols. Inside the system that P. An investigation into Argentina's soccer system that produced the defending World Cup champions found that it is rife with exploitation. This story is also being covered by BBC Science. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 10. Iran live updates. Kuwait and Bahrain condemn heinous Iranian aerial strikes. U.S. forces conducted strikes on Iran on Friday in response to the Iranian drone strike on a Singapore-flagged cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz, according to CENTCOM. This story is also being covered by Al Jazeera, France 24. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 11. How one journalist got ICE agents to open up and confess the agency's greatest sins. They feel like both sides fucking hate them, says independent journalist Carl Loftus. This story is also being covered by Reason. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 12. Donald Trump threatens to annihilate Iran after crossfire over Hormuz, Middle East crisis live. Iran attacked Bahrain and Kuwait after U.S. strikes and threatened a complete halt to talks. U.S. and Iran trade strikes as both sides accuse the other of endangering ceasefire. We have some more details on those Israeli strikes that were reported in Lebanon. See post at 10:28 British Summer Time. Only 2 days after a U.S. brokered agreement was signed between Israel, Lebanon, and the U.S. The deal was designed to work. This story is also being covered by France 24, Axios, ABC News. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 13. World Cup 2026. 215 goals in record-breaking group stage. Austria and Algeria went down to the wire in a match full of drama. Austria's last-minute goal means both teams are through to the next round. Celebrations are also due for the Democratic Republic of Congo, who have qualified for the first time in their history, thanks to their 3-1 win against Uzbekistan. Portugal and Colombia stayed level at 0-0. England finished top of Group L, putting 2 past P. This story is also being covered by Al Jazeera, Sky Sports, BBC Sport. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. Story 14. Venezuela death toll reaches 1,430. More than 3 days after Venezuela was struck by its most powerful earthquake in over a century, hopes of finding survivors are fading. Experts say the first 72 hours are critical for rescues, after which the operation increasingly becomes one of recovering bodies. The confirmed death toll has climbed to 1,430 and continues to rise by the hundreds, while tens of thousands of people remain missing. This story is also being covered by France 24, Bloomberg, The Guardian. Here is some additional context on this developing situation. Multiple sources across the political spectrum are watching this story closely. That is the news for Sunday, June 28, 2026. Stay informed, stay aware. This report is brought to you by CR Specialists, trusted roofing and storm restoration experts. After any storm, visit crspecialists.net for a free roof inspection. Ask for Keith. Subscribe for daily news briefings. See you next time.